So hey, I just saw Hardcore Henry, and I have to admit, I wasn't sold on the idea of a movie filmed entirely from a first-person perspective prior to seeing this one. Frankly, I'm still not. I get the impression that the first-person gimmick is probably better suited to short films and ego-stroking YouTube videos, because no movie in existence should have to carry a motion sickness warning for an entire 90-minute runtime. Even as someone who's not particularly prone to motion sickness, by the end of Hardcore Henry, the contents of my stomach were all set to pay my esophagus alimony, climb into their vintage Pontiac Sunbird, and get the hell out of Dodge. Besides the physical discomfort, there are a lot of problems inherent to a first-person perspective that don't translate well to a non-interactive medium. For instance, it becomes obvious rather quickly that the GoPro they're using to film the movie is mounted on top of the actor's head rather than at eye level, so it makes Henry seem like he's half a foot taller than everybody else, and all the other characters have to look slightly upwards to make eye contact with him, like they're all dogs begging for a fucking handout. And I know this sounds kind of petty, but to put it into context, I want you to participate in an experiment with me. Hold your arms out at full length, and move them around now like you were doing some common action. Opening doors, busting someone's head open with a lead pipe, snorting coke off your forearm in the alley behind a Domino's, etc. Notice how you can see your shoulders in the bottom corners of your field of view? You don't get that in Hardcore Henry because, again, the camera's like 6 to 8 inches above eye level, and eventually you start to notice and it becomes uncanny. It doesn't really matter so much when guns are involved because otherwise the barrel and sights would cover up most of the frame and that would look awful. But during hand-to-hand combat, Henry's limbs are all coming out of the bottom of the screen, so it looks like he's hitting everyone with prop arms on the end of the stick, like we're getting a first-person view of a game of Rock'em Sock'em Robots. Style aside, the movie actually does have a premise. The protagonist is Henry. Duh. A cybernetically enhanced CrossFit trainer and sleeve tattoo enthusiast who wakes up having his limbs reattached in a sequence that's so straight out of a video game, I was half expecting the scientist lady to ask him whether he wanted his camera controls inverted or not. A bunch of rival bros kidnap Henry's sexy wife, standard revenge plot motivation type 2 subtype B, and he's forced to track down the man responsible, an evil corporate stooge who, I swear to fucking God, is Tommy Wiseau. I'm serious, same indecipherable accent, same clumsy line delivery, same absurd sense of fashion. All they did was bleach his hair and bestow him with psychic powers that the movie just kind of forgets to explain somewhere along the way. Henry has to traipse about Moscow looking for the guy who stole his lady, all the while contriving reasons for him to get in fights in a succession of abandoned buildings. Now, if you've played literally any first-person shooter since 2007, you're probably going to begin experiencing some deja vu, because Hardcore Henry hits many of the same notes as one of the more recent Call of Duty games. Namely this one. It's got the same fucking problem those games have as well. Each action sequence feels completely disconnected from the previous one, and it's more like a string of set-piece moments rather than a cohesive whole with the plot delivered in awkward chunks between fight scenes. There's a bit where Henry wakes up, he has to sneak around some guys in a scrapyard, then he has to chase a guy on foot, then he has a shootout in a strip club, which deserves special marks in the completely fucking pointless category, like the director just wanted an excuse to film an orgy. Then there's a vehicle segment where Henry rides in a sidecar with a minigun, then a tank shows up, then a helicopter, then there's a bit where he snipes, and it ultimately concludes with the two leads assaulting the bad guy's lair with heavy ordnance, including a scene where Henry clears a room with a grenade launcher with some of the absolute worst special effects I have ever seen, on par with a pre-rendered cutscene from a PS1 game. The plot is almost beat for beat a retread of Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, just with more shaky cam and less overall horribleness. Another feature this movie shares with COD is its inability to pace itself with an ounce of self-control. Based on the first 15 or so minutes of the movie, you'd be forgiven for thinking that its goal is to be a strictly linear story, with all the events on the same 90-minute stamp of real time. But like a barbershop that's a front for a meth lab, there's an awful lot of unnecessary cutting going on. Like, we'll see Henry open a door to enter a hallway, and then it'll cut straight to him opening the other door at the other end of the hallway. The portions that get cut seem to only last like 1 or 2 seconds tops, and it happens all the time, and sometimes it'll happen in the middle of characters speaking their lines. It's like they took out any part of the movie that didn't involve someone getting shot or having their jaw broken and just kind of worked around it. The movie doesn't leave any space for the audience to catch a breath, and the action just gets boring. For Hardcore Henry, that's really bad, since the action is the only thing on screen for a full hour and a half. Well, okay, not entirely. You see, it wouldn't be a modern action film if we didn't have some wacky, off-color, Joss Whedon-style humor to liven things up. Shelton Copley plays a comic relief sidekick character who has multiple android copies of himself, each dressed for a vastly different time period, and he can switch between any of them at will. He's easily the best part of this movie, even if his jokes only work about half the time. There's some good visual humor with the body-switching mechanic, and there's a neat technical gag at one point where 3 characters are arguing in Russian and the subtitles start to stack on top of each other, but outside of that, most of the jokes are either not given enough time to develop or just forced. Like, there's one scene where Henry just finds a horse out of nowhere, the fucking theme song from Bonanza starts playing, and Henry jumps onto the horse only to immediately fall off. And that's it. That's the joke. I guess. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention, Tim Roth is in this movie. For like a microsecond, but still, what is it with Tim Roth being in so many crap movies lately? Sure, he was fine in The Hateful Eight, but that hardly makes up for goddamn Grace of Monaco. And granted, Hardcore Henry is still leaps and bounds better than that atrocious FIFA movie, but that's hardly a compliment. 90 minutes of watching paint dry would have been more pleasant than United fucking Passions. Even by those patronizingly low standards, there's no excuse for there to be so many royalty-free stock sound effects with so little effort put into the audio mixing it becomes unintentionally hilarious. Aside from what may very well be the best cinematic use of a Queen song since Shaun of the Dead, the soundtrack bounces back and forth between generic punk rock and generic Russian techno, and is overall not much to write home about. So, the story's dull, the characters are underdeveloped, the editing is sloppy, the cinematography is uncomfortable, the acting is meh. And sure, maybe there aren't any better uses of your time at the theater right now, but there are definitely less expensive ways to give yourself a migraine. As a movie, it sucks. As a series of disconnected action sequences, it's not all that bad, but if you do see it to try to live out your sick fantasy of stoving a man's head in with a brick or crushing his testicles in your bare hands, make sure you wait for it to come to DVD so you can pause every once in a while, or at least keep a bottle of Advil next to you so you don't end up with a hardcore headache. Nailed it.